In the heart of South Carolina, during a time when freedom was still fragile and prejudice ran deep, lived a young girl whose name deserves to be remembered: Lula Sherman. She was only 14 years old, the daughter of Co and Lula Sherman, a couple who had once been enslaved but who were striving to build a life of dignity for their family in a hostile world. Lula's story is not simply a tragedy, it is also a window into the resilience, courage, and strength of a community that refused to be silenced. The Shermans, like so many black families after emancipation, carried both hope and hardship in equal measure. They worked the land, raised their children, and tried to carve out safety in a society that constantly reminded them of their vulnerability. Lula was a bright young girl, still on the edge of childhood, whose future should have been full of possibility. Yet, her life would soon be caught up in a moment of violence that revealed the harsh reality of the world she was born into. To understand Lula's story, we must place it in the broader context of black history. Too often, history is reduced to names and dates, leaders, laws, and battles. But the reality of life for millions of black families was written in their daily struggles and their acts of quiet resistance. Every day they survived was an act of defiance. Every time they rebuilt after loss, they showed the world that their spirit could not be broken. Lula's story fits within this larger narrative. The balance between the crushing weight of injustice and the unyielding power of resistance. What happened to Lula was devastating, but it also sparked something remarkable. Her death became more than a personal tragedy, it became a turning point for her community. One that forced men and women to decide whether they would endure in silence or rise to demand dignity. Even at great cost, the courage of those around her changed the course of history in South Carolina, leaving behind a legacy of resistance that still resonates today. This is not an easy story to hear, but it is an important one. It reminds us that history is not just about oppression, it is also about the countless ways people resisted, fought back, and carved out spaces for dignity in a world that often denied their humanity. Lula's story deserves to be told not only as a record of suffering, but as a testament to strength and collective defiance. If you believe stories like this matter, stories of young lives cut short, families who endured, and communities who resisted, then join us on this journey. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others, you help keep history alive. You ensure that Lula Sherman's name is not forgotten, and that the lessons of her story continue to inspire conversations about justice, resilience, and the power of community. This is the beginning of a larger series on black resistance narratives that reveal both the cruelty of the past and the unshakable courage of those who lived through it. Lula's story is only the first step, but it sets the stage for an exploration of what it truly means to resist in the face of overwhelming odds. The Shermans lived under the shadow of Jim Crow, in a South Carolina that promised freedom on paper but delivered constant reminders of inequality and exclusion in reality. For Co and Lula Sherman, who had both endured the cruelties of enslavement, emancipation had been a moment of relief, a chance to imagine a different kind of life. Yet the years that followed were marked not by security but by unrelenting hostility. They raised their children in a world that regarded their very existence with suspicion, where laws and customs were carefully designed to remind them of their place, and where dignity had to be fought for in the smallest daily actions. Against this backdrop, Lula, their daughter, came of age, bright and hopeful, her spirit shaped by the resilience her parents carried within them, but also exposed to the harsh truths of a society that could not accept their humanity as equal. South Carolina after the Civil War was a land of contradictions. There were moments of progress, glimpses of possibility, and stories of individuals who managed to build thriving communities. But woven tightly into that tapestry was a web of restrictions, unwritten codes, and systemic obstacles that stifled nearly every attempt at true advancement. Black families, like the Shermans, might cultivate their land, send their children to modest schools, and gather in churches that became sanctuaries of hope. Yet outside those walls they walked streets where a wrong glance or a misplaced word could lead to humiliation or worse. The system was not only about laws, it was about atmosphere, about the sense of being constantly watched, judged, and hemmed in. For young Lula, every day was an education, not only in reading and writing, but in navigating a world filled with invisible boundaries that her parents prayed she would never have to cross. The Shermans were determined, however, not to let fear dictate their entire existence. Kerr worked tirelessly, taking on labor wherever it was offered, his hands bearing the marks of both his past in bondage and his present in survival. Delia nurtured the family with a quiet strength that came from years of holding pain close to her heart and transforming it into perseverance. Their home was modest, but within its walls there was love, laughter, and the dream that their children could live with more choices than they had ever known. Lula, with her youthful curiosity, was a symbol of that hope. She was stepping into a future that her parents believed might, in time, look different from their own. Yet, even as they dreamed, the realities of Jim Crow pressed in, reminding them daily of the fragility of their progress. Life under such a system was not defined only by external restrictions. It seeped into the very rhythm of daily living. There was the constant need to teach children caution, to instruct them on how to speak and behave in the presence of white neighbors, to lower their voices in public spaces, and to bear slights without protest. For a child like Lula, the lessons of obedience and restraint were as essential as her schoolwork, drilled into her not out of a lack of love, but out of a desperate desire to protect her from a world where innocence offered no shield. The Shermans, like so many other families, balanced hope with vigilance, trying to cultivate joy in their home while preparing their children for the dangers beyond its doors. Despite these hardships, the community around them remained a source of strength. Black churches and schools became places where dignity was reaffirmed, where children learned not only academics but also the value of their heritage, and where families could share burdens too heavy to carry alone. Lula grew up surrounded by this spirit of resilience, hearing stories of survival from her parents and absorbing lessons of endurance from her elders. In the midst of a society bent on erasing or diminishing them, these institutions insisted on their worth, their creativity, and their determination to move forward. To live with dignity under Jim Crow was itself an act of resistance. And in this sense, Lula's very life was part of a larger struggle, one that had been passed down through generations. Still, beneath the surface of resilience lay a constant current of fear. The threats were real, not imagined, and the consequences of a single act of defiance or a moment of being in the wrong place at the wrong time could be devastating. Families carried these unspoken truths with them daily. For Kerr and Delia, this fear never fully left their minds. Even as they tried to shield their children from it, they knew that, despite their best efforts, safety was never guaranteed. They could work hard, follow the rules, teach their children manners and humility, and still watch everything collapse with a single turn of fate. It was a truth that haunted every black family in South Carolina, and it is the truth that framed Lula's brief life. The environment in which Lula lived was therefore one of contradictions, hope and hardship intertwined, dignity and danger existing side by side. The Shermans wanted her to know joy, to dream, and to believe in a brighter tomorrow. Yet they also needed her to recognize the boundaries imposed by a society that refused to see her full humanity. She walked a delicate line, one that countless black children walked at the time, a line drawn not by her family but by a system designed to limit her every step. It is this context, this backdrop of constant hostility and systemic oppression, that makes her story not only heartbreaking but also profoundly important. Lula's life was shaped by forces far beyond her control. by the legacies of enslavement her parents carried, and by the oppressive structures of Jim Crow that dictated so much of daily existence. Yet within that life was also love, determination, and the quiet strength of a family that refused to surrender their humanity. Her story, set against the broader canvas of South Carolina's racial climate, is not only about loss but about the resilience that emerged in the face of relentless opposition. It is a reminder that history is made not just by leaders or grand events but also by the lives of young girls like Lula, whose experiences capture the truth of what it meant to live, to hope, and to endure in a world that too often denied them the space to thrive. After Christmas, when the air was still heavy with the warmth of family gatherings and the small joys that the Shermans allowed themselves despite the challenges of their world, Lula found herself at home alone. The season, meant to carry with it feelings of hope and renewal, lingered in the modest walls of the Sherman household. Coandalia, like so many parents, had tried to make the holiday meaningful for their children, even with limited means. There may have been simple food, shared laughter, and the kind of togetherness that reminded them that family was a refuge in a society that often sought to strip them of safety and dignity. For Lula, still a young teenager, the days after Christmas should have been filled with the innocence of childhood, time spent reflecting on little joys or helping her mother with household tasks. Yet, beneath this fragile peace, the world outside was still marked by the realities of hostility, and it was into this moment of quiet that Walter Waldrop intruded. The Shermans had always known that their home, while filled with love, could never be entirely shielded from the dangers that surrounded them. The rural landscape of South Carolina offered little protection from men who believed themselves entitled to power over others, men who carried with them the legacy of supremacy even decades after emancipation. That December afternoon, when Lula was left alone, was no different from countless other days when families trusted that their children could remain safe for a few hours in the place they called home. For Coandalia, stepping away from the house would not have seemed extraordinary. They had lived long enough to believe that constant vigilance could not always be sustained, but in that short space of time, their absence created a silence that was broken by footsteps they could neither anticipate nor prevent. Walter Waldrop, a white man from their community, entered Lula's world without permission. His intrusion was not only into the physical space of the Sherman household, but into the fragile boundary between childhood and the harshest realities of adulthood that Lula had not yet been prepared to confront. The details of what occurred within those walls cannot be separated from the broader context of the time, a society that allowed such men to act with impunity, knowing that the weight of the system would often protect them, rather than their victims. For Lula, the sudden invasion of her home transformed what should have been a quiet afternoon into a moment that would alter the course of her life and her family's history. The assault on her dignity left scars that went far beyond the physical. In the days that followed, Lula's silence was heavy, a silence that revealed both her youth and the unbearable weight she carried. She did not tell her parents immediately what had happened, perhaps out of fear, confusion, or the awareness that speaking the truth in a world stacked against her would not guarantee justice. For a 14-year-old girl, the decision to hold such a secret must have been crushing, her body bearing the pain of what she endured while her heart carried the unspoken truth. Within her silence lay a reflection of the wider silence that was often demanded of black women and girls during that era, when their voices were too often dismissed, their suffering ignored, and their humanity denied by the society around them. As the days passed, Lula's health began to decline. At first, her family may not have understood the depth of her suffering, hoping perhaps that rest would bring her back to herself, but infection and trauma crept in, overwhelming her young body, and soon it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Her mother, Delia, would have watched with growing fear as her daughter's strength faded, while her father bore the anguish of helplessness. Only near the end, as her life slipped away, did Lula reveal the truth of what had been done to her. To imagine her final moments, held in her mother's arms, is to glimpse the unbearable intersection of innocence and violence, of a family's love and a community's pain. The loss of Lula was not only a private sorrow for the Shermans, it was a devastating blow felt across their community. Her death was more than the tragedy of a young life cut short. It was a symbol of the vulnerability of every black child, of every family who lived under the shadow of injustice. Her father's grief, expressed in words that cut through the silence, carried the weight of generations of pain. For the men of the community, Lula's death was not simply another act of cruelty to be endured. It became a catalyst for action, a moment when the question of whether to remain silent or to resist could no longer be avoided. Waldrip's crime did not fade quietly into the background, as so many similar crimes had in the past. Instead, it ignited a collective anger that refused to be contained. The black men of South Carolina, who had long borne the humiliation and violence of a system designed to keep them powerless, found in Lula's death a reason to push back, however dangerous the consequences might be. What followed was unprecedented: the lynching of Walter Waldrip by black men, an act of resistance that stood as the first of its kind in South Carolina. It was a statement that there were limits to the silence they could be forced to endure, that the dignity of their daughters and sisters demanded a response, even if that response carried the risk of severe retribution. In Lula's story, we see the convergence of innocence, brutality, silence, and resistance. Her life was short, her death heartbreaking, but her legacy became part of a larger narrative of defiance against a system that seemed immovable. The act that took her away also gave rise to one of the rare moments when the oppressed rose up in visible defiance of their oppressors. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, communities could still choose courage over silence. For the Shermans, the loss of Lula would remain an unhealed wound, but for history, her name became tied to an act of resistance that would echo far beyond her small South Carolina community. Her story forces us to reckon not only with the cruelty of her final moments, but also with the enduring strength of those who loved her and the community that chose to honor her memory through their actions. Waldrip assaulted and fatally injured Lula, leaving behind not only a broken body but a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. What happened in that small house after Christmas was not simply an act of cruelty against one girl. It was an event that revealed the vulnerability of an entire community living under the crushing weight of injustice. Lula, just 14 years old, was forced into an experience that no child should have to bear, and in the aftermath she carried the pain quietly, withdrawing into herself as if she understood that speaking out might change nothing and could even bring more danger to her family. Her silence was not consent. It was the silence of someone who had been forced to carry a burden too heavy for her years, a silence born out of fear and the understanding that in her world, truth did not always lead to justice. The trauma left its mark immediately. Her body, still so young, could not withstand the violence she endured, and the injury began to fester. In an era when medical care was scarce and often inaccessible to black families, what might have been survivable with proper attention became a slow and agonizing decline. At first, her parents may have thought she was suffering from an ordinary illness, something that could be soothed with home remedies and a mother's touch. But soon it became evident that the damage went deeper. Her strength faded with each passing day, and the sparkle of youthful energy that had once filled the Sherman household dimmed before their eyes. For Co and Delia, watching their daughter weaken was an agony compounded by uncertainty. They had lived long enough to know that danger lurked in many forms. Yet they could not have imagined that their child's life would be claimed within the supposed safety of their own home. Lula's silence must have been bewildering for them, as they cared for her without understanding the full truth of what had been done. In her final days, the weight of the secret became too heavy, and it was then, as she lay in her mother's arms, that she revealed what had happened. The truth was devastating, transforming their grief into a fury that could not easily be contained. The Sherman family's sorrow became the community's sorrow. News of Lula's fate spread quickly, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because it crystallized the precarious position of every black family in South Carolina. If a young girl could be harmed in her own home and her suffering ignored by the very system meant to protect the vulnerable, then no one was safe. The grief that poured out in the days after her death was mingled with outrage, and conversations in churchyards and meeting places turned toward action. The community, long accustomed to absorbing insult and injury, found in Lula's death a breaking point. Waldrip's crime was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, one in which men like him acted with confidence that the law would shield them from consequences. For generations, violence against black women and girls had been ignored or excused, their voices dismissed as though their pain did not matter. Lula's death exposed that reality in the starkest terms. This time, however, the silence did not hold. The anguish of Sherman's testimony, the raw grief of a father who had lost his daughter in such a cruel way, struck a chord with other men in the community. They had endured countless wrongs, but Lula's story was one they could not allow to fade into the background. The decision to act did not come easily. Those who considered striking back against Waldrip knew the risks they faced. The system was not built to protect them, but to punish them should they step outside the narrow confines it allowed. Yet grief and outrage can dissolve fear, and in the wake of Lula's death, the men around decided that silence was no longer possible. For the first time in South Carolina, black men carried out the lynching of a white man, seizing Waldrip and ending his life as he had ended Lula's. It was a radical act, one that defied the social order and sent shockwaves through their community and beyond. What happened next revealed the depth of systemic injustice. Rather than acknowledging the crime Waldrip had committed or the suffering endured by Lula, authorities turned their full force on the black men who had retaliated. Arrests were made, charges brought, and trials held, with the courtroom becoming a stage on which Lula's humanity was minimized while her community was vilified. In an astonishing twist of cruelty, blame was shifted toward her, her family, and those who sought justice in the only way they felt possible. The very system that should have defended her dignity instead sought to erase her from the narrative, reducing her to a footnote in her own story. Yet, despite the injustice of the legal proceedings, the legacy of Lula's death could not be erased. Her story circulated as a testament to both the horrors endured and the courage displayed in response. For her community, it became a symbol of dignity reclaimed in the face of terror. The men who acted did so knowing the consequences, but their defiance stood as proof that there were limits to what could be endured in silence. Even when the system sought to punish them, the very act of resistance marked a shift, a reminder that oppression could never completely extinguish the will to fight back. Lula's short life, and the violence that ended it, became a point of connection between generations. Her name carried with it the sorrow of a family, the fury of a community, and the defiance of those who refused to accept a world where such cruelty could pass without answer. To tell her story is to confront not only the brutality of her death, but also the strength of those who responded. It is to acknowledge that within the deepest tragedies there can be found moments of profound courage, moments that continue to resonate long after the immediate pain has passed. In remembering Lula Sherman, we do not only grieve what was lost, we honor the resilience that her death inspired and the unbroken spirit of a people determined to resist. The weeks following the winter holidays cast a heavy silence over the Sherman household, one that grew heavier with each passing day as Lula's health slipped further away. Once lively and full of quiet energy, her laughter replaced by a strained stillness. She now moved through her days with a shadow of pain she could not conceal. Her parents, Co and Leah, watched helplessly as their daughter's body weakened, puzzled by the mystery of her sudden decline. They asked gentle questions, tried to coax her into sharing what troubled her. But Lula, carrying a weight too heavy for her young shoulders, remained quiet. There was fear in her silence, a fear her parents recognized though they did not yet know its cause. In their world, silence was often a shield, a way of protecting oneself from dangers that could not be named aloud. The Jim Crow South was a place where truth itself could be dangerous, and Lula seemed to understand that too well for her age. The secret she carried stayed locked within her, but the toll it took could not be hidden. Her once bright eyes grew dim, her steps faltered, and each night she winced under waves of pain that no medicine in their modest home could ease. Neighbors began to notice her absence from gatherings and church, whispering among themselves that something terrible must have happened. Her parents, hearts breaking, prayed and hoped, yet the answers they sought remained just out of reach. As the days blurred into weeks, the young girl who had once been full of promise became almost unrecognizable. Lula grew frail, her voice reduced to whispers, and her body weakened under the strain of both the hidden trauma and the infection that gnawed away at her strength. The home, once filled with the simple joys of family life, was now cloaked in worry, with every sound of her coughing or groaning echoing like a reminder of their helplessness. The Shermans had endured hardship before, surviving enslavement and the struggles of freedom in a world still hostile to their existence. But nothing had prepared them for watching their child fade in such a way. Their faith gave them courage, yet the unanswered questions gnawed at them day and night. Eventually, Lula could no longer carry her secret alone. Her health had deteriorated so severely that she found herself unable to mask her suffering, and in moments of weakness she revealed the truth of what had happened to her. The revelation was shattering, a story that brought with it both anguish and fury. For her parents, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and with them came the realization that the violence of the world outside had reached into the very heart of their home. The Shermans understood too well that in a society designed to silence people like them, justice would be nearly impossible. Yet the truth spoken aloud could not be ignored. Lula's decline was no longer just an illness without name. It was the visible mark of an act that had robbed her of safety, innocence, and health. The infection worsened, feeding on her weakened body, and though family and neighbors tried to care for her, their remedies were no match for the damage done. Her once vibrant spirit, now clouded with both physical agony and emotional scars, flickered in and out like a candle fighting against the wind. The home became a place of both quiet care and mounting sorrow, as her parents sat by her bedside each night, whispering prayers, singing hymns, and holding her hand, as though their love could anchor her to the world. The tragedy of Lula's silence was not hers alone, but reflected the silence forced upon countless others in her community. She bore within her the reality of living in a time when speaking out meant risking even greater harm. Her body weakened, but her presence carried a testimony that could not be erased, even as her voice faltered. For Co and Leah, watching their daughter fade was not just the loss of a child but a cruel reminder of the forces stacked against families like theirs, forces that turned even the safety of home into a fragile illusion. Each passing day left the Sherman family more desperate, yet their love for Lula remained steadfast. They clung to her as fiercely as they clung to the hope that telling her story, even in whispers, might one day bring meaning to their suffering. Though the infection consumed her strength, her memory and the truth she carried lived on, etched into the fabric of her family's history. A painful reminder of both the vulnerability and the resilience of those who endured. In the end, Lula's silence and her suffering were not signs of weakness but reflections of the harsh reality of her time. where the courage to survive itself was an act of resistance. The Sherman home had grown unbearably quiet in those final days, a silence broken only by the sounds of Lula's shallow breathing and the soft prayers of her mother at her bedside. Delia had scarcely left her daughter's side, her arms a constant cradle of comfort. As if by holding Lula close she could shield her from the pain that had consumed her. Ko lingered nearby, his presence steady though his heart was breaking, torn between helplessness and the instinct to protect what he could not save. The once lively rhythm of their household had slowed to a mournful stillness, every room heavy with grief as they watched their child fade. Lula's strength, already drained by weeks of suffering, was slipping away faster with each passing hour, and both parents knew, though neither dared to say it aloud, that the end was drawing near. In those fragile hours, when the veil between life and death grew thin, Lula seemed to find a voice she had kept buried. Her body was weak, her breathing labored, but she summoned what little strength remained to share words her family would never forget. Resting in her mother's embrace, she whispered fragments of the truth that had remained unspoken, a story that laid bare the cruelty she had endured and the reason for her decline. Each word carried with it the weight of her suffering. And though her voice faltered, her eyes held a clarity that pierced the hearts of her parents. It was not just the revelation of violence that shattered them, but the realization that their daughter had carried this burden in silence for so long, too afraid of what the world might do if she had spoken sooner. For Delia, the moment was both devastating and sacred. She clutched her child closer, rocking her gently as though she were once again the baby she had nursed and sung to, trying to pour every ounce of love into her final moments. Her tears fell freely, yet she did not look away, determined that her daughter would not leave this world unseen or unheard. Standing close, felt an anger rise alongside his grief, a deep fury at the injustice that had stolen his child's chance at life. But above all, there was sorrow, the kind that comes from knowing no act of love or faith could turn back what had been done. As Lula's words trailed into silence, her breathing grew more uneven, the pauses between each breath stretching longer. Her parents held her as though they could anchor her spirit to the earth a little longer, whispering words of comfort, reciting familiar hymns, calling her name softly into the dim light of their home. Neighbors who had gathered outside in quiet support could sense the heaviness within, the solemn truth that the Shermans were saying goodbye. In that moment, Lula's suffering ended, her young life slipping away in the arms of the mother who had fought so hard to protect her, leaving behind not just grief but a story that would echo far beyond their home. Her passing was not only a tragedy for her family but a reflection of the peril that hung over every black household in the South during that era. The vulnerability of children like Lula was not an isolated misfortune but part of a larger truth that shaped their lives, a truth in which innocence was too often stolen, and justice remained out of reach. For the Shermans, her death was both a personal loss and a painful reminder of the dangers that shadowed their existence. Lula's story became part of their legacy, a memory they carried not with shame, but with a determination to honor her life, and to remember her not only for the pain she endured but also for the love she had given and received. In the quiet that followed, the Sherman home became a place of mourning. Yet within the sorrow, there was also a sense of bearing witness. Lula's final moments had revealed what silence had once hidden, and in speaking her truth, she had left behind a message her parents would hold onto for the rest of their days. They would remember her not as the frail figure of her last weeks, but as the spirited daughter who had brightened their lives, whose laughter once filled their rooms, and whose courage in the face of unimaginable fear was a testament to her strength. In the end, Lula's life, though short, became a powerful reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit, and her story lived on as a quiet act of defiance against a world that had tried to erase her voice. When Lula's final breath left her, A wave of grief spread through her family like a storm breaking over still water. And Sherman found himself crushed beneath a sorrow so profound it felt as though it might tear him apart. He had labored his entire life to build a world where his children could grow with dignity. And yet in the span of days he had been forced to bury the light of his daughter's future. His grief was not silent. It poured out of him in the days after Lula's death, in cries that echoed across the small community, in the slump of his shoulders as he walked through familiar fields that now felt alien, and in the trembling of his voice as he spoke to neighbors who gathered at his door. His words were heavy with both anguish and fury, for he knew that Lula's death had not been an act of nature, but the result of a cruelty rooted in the very soil of South Carolina. The black community around the Shermans felt this loss as if it were their own. For Lula was not just one family's child, she was a symbol of the vulnerability they all lived with under a system that denied their humanity. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers looked into the eyes of their sons and daughters with renewed fear. And elders who had endured slavery saw in Lula's death a bitter reminder that freedom had not brought true safety. Her name passed from home to home, carried in whispers that grew into a roar of outrage. And the sorrow of the Shermans became a wound felt by the entire community. At gatherings, spoke openly about what had been done to his daughter, and though his voice sometimes broke under the weight of his pain, there was a fire within him that could not be contained. He spoke not just of loss but of the injustice of it, the way a young life had been crushed without consequence, the way his family's dignity had been stripped bare. His grief became a mirror for every parent who feared the same fate for their own children, and his anger became a spark that lit something larger than himself. He was not a man who had ever sought conflict, yet he could not carry this burden quietly. And in telling his story he gave voice to the anger simmering in so many hearts. The people who gathered to comfort the Shermans found themselves unable to simply sit in silence. What had been done to Lula demanded more than prayers and tears. It demanded action. And though the risks of resistance were immense, there was a sense that the time for endurance had ended. For years, they had endured insults, threats, and violence, telling themselves to survive another day, to protect their families by remaining silent. But Lula's death shattered that fragile balance. The idea that a young girl could be taken from life in such a way, with no expectation of justice from the courts or the authorities, left many with the belief that survival alone was no longer enough. Co's grief became a rallying cry, though he had never intended it as such. In the brokenness of his mourning, others found clarity, and in his anger they recognized their own. He had stood at his daughter's grave with tears streaming down his face, his fists clenched in helpless rage, and the sight of him haunted those who saw it. The image of a father forced to bury his child, not because of illness or accident but because of cruelty, became a symbol that lingered in the minds of his neighbors long after the soil had been laid over Lula's resting place. Men who had once accepted silence as the safer path began to talk in hushed tones about what must be done. They spoke of dignity, of honor, of the need to protect their families in a world that offered them no protection. They gathered in barns, in fields, and on back porches, their voices low but their determination rising. And though fear was ever present, it was tempered by a deeper anger that refused to be silenced. Lula's story became a turning point, not only for the Shermans but for an entire community that saw in her death the breaking point of their patience. For the women of the community, Lula's death was a reminder of their constant vulnerability, yet it also deepened their resolve. They wept with Delia, they prayed with her, and they vowed that her daughter's name would not be forgotten. Children, too young to fully grasp the weight of what had happened, sensed the shift in the air, the way their parents carried themselves with a new gravity. The way conversations turned from whispered fears to declarations that something must change. In those days following Lula's passing, the Shermans' grief became the heart of a story larger than themselves. Coe's pain was undeniable, his anger uncontainable, and it fused with the sorrow of his community until it grew into something that could no longer be ignored. What began as the tragedy of a single family quickly became the spark for resistance. A reminder that beneath the oppression of Jim Crow lay a well of strength and defiance waiting to be unleashed. Though Coe would have given anything to hold his daughter again, to return to the life they had before, he could not undo what had been done. All he could do was speak, mourn, and let his grief ignite the will of others. In thy Lula's death, though devastating, became a catalyst for change, and her father's sorrow became part of a larger legacy of resistance that would shape the course of their community's history. The anger that swept through the community after Lula's death was not fleeting. It grew heavier with each passing day, pressing down on men who had already borne the weight of injustice their entire lives. They had watched neighbors humiliated without recourse, seen friends beaten without consequence, and heard too many stories of young women left unprotected in a society that refused to recognize their worth. But Lula's death was different. It was not only a crime against one family, but a strike against the dignity of the entire black community. And it left many believing that silence could no longer be endured. In quiet meetings beneath the cover of night, words long suppressed began to surface. Men who had carried fear in their bones spoke aloud of the need to defend their people. Even if it meant risking their own lives, it was in those gatherings that a decision took shape. A decision that would mark a turning point not just for the Shermans, but for the history of South Carolina. Walter Waldrip, the man whose actions had destroyed Lula's life, walked the town as though nothing had changed, shielded by a system that had never held men like him accountable. For the community, his presence was a constant reminder that justice, in the form they had long prayed for, would never come from the courts or from those who claimed to uphold the law. The choice before them was stark: endure the indignity of silence or take justice into their own hands. It was a dangerous path, for the consequences of resistance under Jim Crow were swift and merciless. But in the hearts of those grieving Lula, the greater danger lay in allowing her death to pass unavenged, a wound left open with no acknowledgement of its cause. The men who gathered to act did not come to their decision lightly. They were fathers, husbands, brothers, men who knew the risks, who understood that their actions might bring death upon themselves, yet who could no longer look their families in the eye if they did nothing. The planning was quiet, carried out with care, for discovery would mean destruction. But their resolve only deepened as the hours stretched into nights. They were bound together by more than anger. They were bound by the belief that their daughters, their wives, and their mothers deserved to live without fear, and that no community could survive if its children could be harmed without consequence. When the night finally came, it was not with reckless fury but with deliberate purpose. Waldrip was taken, and in that moment, for the first time in the history of South Carolina, black men carried out the act that white mobs had long used to terrorize their own people. But this time, it was not the hand of oppression that moved, it was the hand of resistance. An act born from grief and a refusal to accept that Lula's life could be erased without answer. The air was heavy with silence as it unfolded. A silence not of fear but of certainty. A recognition that what was happening was both irreversible and necessary. The men who stood together that night knew they were crossing a line that could never be stepped back over. They knew the price they might pay. Yet they also knew that their action would send a message far louder than any words could carry. That the community would no longer remain passive in the face of such cruelty. Lula's death demanded dignity, and in their eyes, this was the only way to restore it. When word of what had happened spread, it rippled through both black and white communities with equal force, though in vastly different tones. For black families, there was a sense of grim vindication, a recognition that, for once, justice had not been denied completely. For white authorities, however, It was an act of defiance that could not be ignored. A breach of the racial order they sought to enforce. Tension grew like a storm cloud over the region, and everyone knew that repercussions were inevitable. But even as fear mounted, there was also pride, a deep awareness that something unprecedented had occurred, something that altered the balance of power. However briefly, in a land where power had always flowed in one direction, the lynching of Waldrip was not just a moment of vengeance, it was a declaration, a cry against the silence that had suffocated their community for generations. It was a risk that might cost the men their lives. Yet it was also a step toward reclaiming humanity in a world determined to strip it away. For the Shermans, it did not bring Lula back, nor did it erase the grief that lingered in every corner of their home. But it did offer one small measure of recognition that her life had mattered, that her death had not been forgotten, and that those who loved her would not let her memory fade without consequence. History would remember this act not only for its rarity but for what it symbolized: a community's refusal to remain voiceless in the face of unbearable loss. It was a moment when pain transformed into courage, when sorrow fueled defiance, and when the death of a 14-year-old girl inspired men to do what had once seemed unthinkable. In the shadow of that night, South Carolina would never be quite the same, and neither would the legacy of the black resistance that Lula's story had awakened. In the days that followed the lynching of Walter Waldrip, the quiet courage of the community gave way to the thunder of retribution from the authorities. Word of what had happened traveled quickly, and where there might have been space for recognition of Lula's suffering, there was only outrage that black men had dared to defy the racial order. Instead of asking how a young girl's life had been cut short, officials moved with determination to hunt down those who had taken justice into their own hands. The men who had acted out of grief and fury, bound together in defense of their people, were now marked as criminals, and the full weight of the system was bent on making an example of them. Arrests came swiftly, not with the care of measured justice but with the force of vengeance. Homes were raided, men dragged from their families in the dark of night, the sound of boots and the clinking of chains replacing the whispers of solidarity that had filled the community only days before. Each arrest carried a message, not just to those involved but to every black family who dared to dream of safety or justice. The law was not theirs to wield, and resistance would be punished. Fathers and sons who had walked proudly into church pews now found themselves behind bars, their names spoken with fear and trembling by neighbors who knew all too well what awaited them in court. When the trials began, they revealed not the pursuit of truth, but the determination of the state to restore order at any cost. Lula's name, the very reason for the act of resistance, was barely spoken in the proceedings. Her death was pushed aside, treated as incidental, while the full focus of the prosecution rested on the audacity of the men who had dared to confront the racial boundaries of South Carolina. Witnesses were called, evidence bent, and arguments twisted until the narrative no longer resembled the reality of what had happened. Instead of acknowledging the suffering that had led to this desperate act, the courtrooms resounded with accusations, as though it were not Waldrip's violence but the Shermans' grief that had caused this chain of events. For Delia and Co. Sherman, the pain of watching their neighbors and friends stand trial was compounded by the cruelty of hearing their daughter's life dismissed. The same system that had ignored Lula's suffering now sought to turn blame upon her family, suggesting in sly words and insinuations that they had failed her, that her mother had not protected her, that her death was not the consequence of Waldrip's crime but of weakness within their home. It was a twisting of truth so sharp it cut deeper than any blade, leaving scars on hearts already broken. Co's anger, once the cry of a grieving father, was now twisted into evidence against his community, his grief reframed as dangerous defiance. The men on trial stood as symbols of both courage and vulnerability. Their faces carried the weight of sacrifice, and though they maintained dignity in the face of accusations, They knew that justice was never the true purpose of the proceedings. The outcome had been decided before the first gavel struck. They would be punished. And through their punishment, the state would attempt to silence the spirit of resistance that Lula's death had ignited. Sentences fell like heavy stones, each one crushing hope a little further. Yet each one also laying bare the truth that the law was not neutral but an instrument designed to maintain the very hierarchy that had led to Lula's death. Beyond the walls of the courtroom, the community carried a sorrow that mixed with fear. Families whispered of what might happen next, of how many more lives might be lost to the retaliation of those who had always seen black dignity as a threat. Mothers wept not only for their imprisoned husbands and sons, but for the cruel certainty that Lula's story had been erased from the official record. Her suffering denied in favor of punishing those who had dared to speak through action when words had failed. Yet beneath the fear, there was also a quiet determination, a refusal to let her name be forgotten even if the courts tried to bury it. For every headline that painted the men as criminals, there were whispered stories in kitchens and fields that told the truth, that they had acted because a young girl's life had been stolen and no one else would answer for it. For every accusation against the Shermans, there were neighbors who wrapped their arms around Delia and Co., reminding them that they were not alone, that their daughter's name would live on in the memory of those who refused to let her story die. The law could punish bodies, but it could not erase the truth written in the hearts of a grieving people. The trials, though devastating in their injustice, revealed the lengths to which the system would go to protect its own and silence resistance. They showed the world that Lula's death was not enough to awaken compassion in those in power, but it was more than enough to awaken courage in those who had always lived under its weight. While the men were led away in chains, their community held on to the belief that resistance, once ignited, could not be extinguished, that even in the face of crushing injustice, the story of a 14-year-old girl would continue to echo, shaping the will of those who came after. In the end, the prosecutions did not erase the truth, they only sharpened it, carving it into the memory of a community that would carry Lula's name forward, not as a tale of despair but as a reminder of what it meant to stand up against terror, even when the cost was unbearably high. Lula's story, though deeply painful, is not just the story of a single girl in South Carolina, but a testament to an entire community that chose dignity and courage over silence. Her name may not appear in most history books, but her experience reveals the raw truth of an era when countless lives were shaped by injustice, resilience, and the demand for humanity. Lula did not ask to become a symbol, yet her suffering and the response it provoked left behind a lesson that would echo far beyond her hometown, reminding generations that silence only protects the oppressor while courage, though costly, lights the path forward. The black men who chose to act in her defense made a decision that was both dangerous and extraordinary. In a time when the scales of justice were tilted so heavily against them, they stood up, knowing full well that the system would not be on their side. Their actions came with devastating consequences, but they also broke through the narrative that black communities would always submit in the face of cruelty. By rising, they declared that the lives and dignity of their daughters, sisters, and wives mattered, even if society refused to recognize it. Lula's story became the rallying point that exposed both the brutality of the system and the unbreakable will of those who resisted it. Authorities could silence voices, punish acts of defiance, and twist narratives to protect the guilty, but they could not erase the truth of what happened to Lula Sherman. Her story lingered, whispered from generation to generation, not only as a memory of pain, but as a reminder that survival and resistance often come at a terrible price. It showed that while laws and courts may have failed, communities could still carve out their own definition of justice, however imperfect, to reclaim a sense of dignity that oppression sought to crush. When we remember Lula, We are not only remembering a girl whose life was altered by violence and indifference. We are remembering the countless unnamed who endured similar injustices, but whose stories never reached the public eye. She stands as a voice for them, for all the families who carried wounds that history tried to bury. By keeping her memory alive, we honor not just her, but the broader struggle for recognition, equality, and the right to live free from fear. Lula's story also challenges us today. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the meaning of justice, about whose voices get heard, and about how far we are willing to go to defend the dignity of those around us. Her legacy is not only in the act of resistance itself, but in the way it continues to inspire reflection, solidarity, and the ongoing pursuit of a society that values all its members equally. As we close this story, let us not only carry Lula Sherman's name in memory, but also recognize the broader lesson her life imparts, that justice is rarely handed down freely, that dignity often requires sacrifice, and that even in the darkest moments, the act of standing up can change the course of history. Her story is a call to remember, to reflect, and to honor the countless voices who fought, endured, and hoped for a better world. Thank you for listening and for walking through this difficult but important journey with us. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with others so that these hidden pieces of history can continue to reach more hearts and minds. Together, we can ensure that stories like Lula's are never forgotten. And now, as you rest and prepare for tomorrow, may you carry with you the strength of her courage and the quiet power of her resilience. Good night, and may peace be with you.